What happens when a world-famous professor challenges Islam, only to be answered by a quiet student with nothing but a backpack and a heart full of truth? In one of England's most prestigious universities, hundreds gathered for an interfaith seminar led by Professor Edward Langston, a renowned theologian known for his sharp criticisms of religion, especially Islam. He stood before a packed hall and issued a bold challenge. If anyone believes Islam is the truth, prove it. But use reason, not faith. The crowd laughed. No one stood until one young man did. His name was Amir. He wasn't a scholar, he wasn't a preacher, but that night his calm voice and sincere answers would shake the very foundation of pride, ego, and ignorance, not through argument but through clarity, humility, and courage. What began as a public attempt to humiliate Islam turned into a moment that left an entire audience in tears and a respected professor whispering words no one expected to hear. This isn't just a debate, it's a spiritual awakening, and you're about to witness it. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real powerful stories. The ancient lecture hall at Cambridge University was alive with murmurs and anticipation. Professors, researchers, and students filled every seat drawn to an interfaith seminar featuring one of the most formidable voices in modern theology, Professor Edward Langston. Known for his scathing critiques of religion, especially Islam, Langston stood tall at the podium, his voice calm yet commanding. "We live in an age of reason," he declared, "not myth, not superstition. If anyone here still believes Islam holds absolute truth, then stand up. Prove it, but use logic, not blind faith." Laughter flickered across the room, students exchanged amused glances. No one moved. Langston smirked, folding his arms. "Exactly what I thought." But then quiet footsteps echoed through the stillness. From the middle of the hall, a lone figure rose. A young man in a simple navy jacket carrying a worn backpack walked forward with calm purpose. He looked no different than any other student, except for the steady resolve in his eyes. "My name is Amir," he said clearly, his voice calm but firm. "I am a Muslim, and I accept your challenge." The room froze. Laughter turned to surprise. Some students shifted in their seats, curious. Langston raised an eyebrow. "Very well, Amir, let's see if your faith can survive reason." But Amir didn't look defensive. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, not as a warrior, but as a witness. And though he was alone, he carried something ancient, something unseen, not arrogance, not fear, only truth. And it was about to speak. Professor Langston's voice rang out with crisp confidence. "You claim there is a God, but tell me, Amir, can you see him, hear him, touch him? Isn't believing in something invisible just wishful thinking?" The audience leaned in, expecting a struggle, but Amir didn't flinch. He stepped calmly toward the microphone, his eyes thoughtful, his hands at ease. "Professor," he said, "may I ask, can you see gravity or touch oxygen?" Langston raised an eyebrow, puzzled. "Of course not, but we feel them." Amir nodded gently. "Exactly. We believe in what we cannot see because we witness its effects. Gravity holds us to the earth. Oxygen keeps us alive. We never question their presence because the evidence surrounds us." He paused, letting his words settle. "God is the same. You may not see him, but his signs are everywhere. The rising of the sun, the rhythm of the heart, the code within DNA. The universe operates with such precision that even 1 degree off would lead to chaos. That is not random, that is design." A thoughtful silence took over the room. Some students lowered their phones. A few professors leaned forward, intrigued. Amir continued. "In the Quran, God asks a simple question. Were they created by nothing, or did they create themselves? Even reason tells us nothing comes from nothing." Langston narrowed his eyes. He hadn't expected this level of clarity. "Fine," he said with a smirk. "Let's say there is a God. But why must he be one? Why not 3, as we believe?" Amir stepped a little closer to the edge of the platform, because logic rejects contradiction. If 2 gods existed and wanted different things, who would have authority? If one wished for rain and the other for sun, which one controls the sky? He gestured softly to the audience. "But we don't see chaos, we see harmony. balance from the galaxies to ourselves. Everything functions with unity. He reached into his jacket and unfolded a small notepad. The Quran says, if there were other gods besides Allah, the heavens and the earth would have collapsed into disorder. Several students who had earlier smirked at Amir's courage now looked stunned. Others exchanged glances. This wasn't a sermon. It was a conversation rooted in clarity and depth. Amir's voice softened. Islam teaches that God is one, not because it's dogma, but because it is a logical necessity. Oneness brings order. Multiplicity brings division. Langston stood still, his arms no longer crossed. He didn't speak. Not yet. For the first time in years, someone wasn't trying to overpower him. They were inviting him to think, and that invitation, spoken not with force but with humility, was beginning to open doors he had kept shut for far too long. The silence in the lecture hall was no longer tense. It was thoughtful. Professor Langston, known for dismantling religious claims with sharp logic, stood quiet. His earlier confidence had softened into cautious contemplation, but he wasn't done. "All right, Amir," he said slowly, folding his hands. "Let's move on from the idea of God. You say Muhammad was his prophet, but how do you know he wasn't just another man claiming divine inspiration? History is full of such men." Amir smiled, not out of smugness, but sincerity. "That's an important question, Professor, because if Muhammad's claim is false, then Islam collapses. But if it's true, then it deserves serious reflection." He took a breath, then continued with calm conviction. "The first thing to understand is this: Muhammad was illiterate. He couldn't read, he couldn't write. Yet the Quran he conveyed word for word is considered the greatest literary work in the Arabic language." A few Arabic-speaking students nodded quietly in agreement. Even the most gifted poets of his time couldn't match its rhythm, structure, or depth. The Quran itself challenges humanity. Produce one chapter like it if you can. No one ever has, not then, not now. Professor Langston shifted slightly, but Amir wasn't done. But it's not just the eloquence, it's the content. The Quran contains accurate descriptions of embryology, oceanography, and astronomy, centuries before modern science confirmed them. Could an illiterate man living in the desert have guessed all that? He let the question hang. Then there's Muhammad's character. Before revelation, he was known as Al-Amin, the trustworthy. Even his enemies testified to his honesty. Langston interjected almost reflexively. "But wasn't he offered wealth and power? How do we know he wasn't just ambitious?" Amir nodded. "He was offered everything: money, status, even marriage to elite women, if he would just stop preaching. But he refused. He chose poverty. He was mocked, beaten, exiled. He buried 6 of his 7 children. He lost his wife, his uncle, his protectors." His voice lowered. Yet when he returned to Mecca, the very city that tortured and expelled him, he didn't take revenge. He forgave them. No executions, no humiliation. Just mercy. The room was still. A history professor in the back blinked. Visibly moved, a few students leaned closer, as if drawn not just to the facts but the spirit behind them. Amir continued gently. "A liar does not endure all that for a lie. A power-hungry man doesn't live like the poor cry in prayer at night or forgive those who tried to kill him." He looked at Professor Langston not as an opponent, but as a seeker. Muhammad didn't live for himself. He lived for a message of justice, mercy, and truth. And in that moment, the prophet was no longer a distant figure lost to time. Through Amir's words, he came alive as a man of truth. And truth was beginning to speak louder than doubt. Professor Langston's fingers tapped the podium. His voice, once sharp, now carried a faint trace of hesitation. "If Muhammad was as noble as you claim, Amir, then help me understand. Why did he marry multiple women? And what about the violence? Didn't he lead wars? Didn't he kill?" The room tensed. Students exchanged glances. These were the questions that usually silenced the room or started heated arguments. But Amir didn't recoil. His voice remained calm. "Thank you, Professor," he said, "for asking what many are afraid to. Because the truth doesn't fear difficult questions, it welcomes them." He took a slow breath and began. "Yes, the prophet had multiple wives, but his first and only wife for 25 years was Khadijah, a strong, wealthy woman who proposed to him. He remained faithful to her until she passed away. His other marriages happened after her death when he was over 50. Amir scanned the room, meeting the eyes of a few students. Most of those women were widows older or in need of protection. These marriages had political, social, or humanitarian purposes, uniting tribes safeguarding the vulnerable. They were not about desire, they were about responsibility. A quiet murmur moved through the audience. A few surprised expressions softened. As for warfare, Amir continued. Yes, the Prophet led battles, but never for conquest. Every major battle, Badr, Uhud, the trench was defensive. His people were tortured, exiled, starved. They fought to survive. His voice grew firmer but remained respectful. And when he had the power to take revenge, he didn't. When he re-entered Mecca with an army, he lowered his head in humility. There were no mass punishments, no executions. He forgave his enemies. Langston remained quiet, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. But he said, lowering his voice, "What about Aisha? She was very young. How do you justify that?" Today, gas rippled through the room. Some braced for discomfort, but Amir stood steady. "I'm glad you asked, because this is a topic that deserves honesty, not avoidance." He stepped forward slightly. Yes, Aisha was young, but in 7th century Arabia, and much of the world at that time, including Europe, marriage age was tied to maturity, not an arbitrary number. Life expectancy was shorter. Culture and norms were different. He paused before continuing. More importantly, their marriage wasn't hidden. It was celebrated public and supported by her family, and Aisha herself spoke of it with pride. She later became one of Islam's greatest scholars, brilliant, articulate, and fiercely independent. A religious studies professor in the front row began taking notes. If their relationship had been abusive or shameful, she would not have become the Prophet's most trusted witness. She led discussions. She taught men and women. She shaped Islamic scholarship. Amir looked back at the professor. Times have changed, yes, and Islam acknowledges that we are not told to copy ancient customs blindly. We are told to follow core values, compassion, wisdom, and justice. The tension in the room melted into reflection. For the first time, the questions that once caused fear had become bridges of understanding. The hall had grown quiet, not from tension, but reverence. Even those who had entered with skepticism now listened with softened eyes and open hearts. Professor Langston looked down at his notes, fingers trembling slightly. The audience watched him not as a scholar in control, but as a man on the edge of discovery. Slowly, he raised his eyes. "Amir," he said gently, "if Muhammad is your prophet, then what do you believe about Jesus? Do Muslims reject him completely?" Amir's expression softened. "No, Professor," he said warmly. "We don't reject him. We love him dearly." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Even some Christian students turned to each other, eyebrows raised in Islam. Amir continued, "Jesus, known to us as Isa, is one of the greatest messengers of God. He was born of the Virgin Mary, without a father, by the will of God alone. He performed miracles, healing the sick, giving sight to the blind, even raising the dead, all by God's permission." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "We believe he was sent to guide the children of Israel, and we believe he will return before the end of time." Professor Langston's voice cracked just slightly. "Then, where do we differ?" Amir nodded gently, choosing his words with care. "The difference lies not in our love for Jesus, but in his identity. Islam teaches that Jesus was a prophet of God, not God himself, a servant of the Almighty, not his son." A few heads turned. Some leaned in closer. The tone of the room was no longer debate, it was dialogue. Even in the Bible, Amir added, Jesus prays, he weeps, he asks for help. He says, "Not my will, but yours be done." If he were God, would he need to pray? Would he need help? Langston stared at his notes, but this time he wasn't reading, he was remembering. "So yes," Amir said, his voice low and steady. "We believe in Jesus not as God, but as a messenger. We honor him, we follow his teachings, we await his return. But we do not worship him." In the back row, a Christian student whispered, "I never knew Muslims believed that." Another asked quietly, "Then, do they think we're wrong?" Amir turned, addressing the student directly. "I believe Christians are sincere seekers of God, And anyone who sincerely seeks truth with humility and an open heart will find it. Islam doesn't teach us to mock others. It teaches us to speak with wisdom and compassion. He turned back to the front. We may differ in doctrine, yes, but we share love for the same Creator. And perhaps that's where bridges can begin. Silence swept through the hall, not the silence of doubt, but the stillness of hearts opening. Professor Langston blinked slowly. He took off his glasses, and for a moment he wasn't a critic. He was simply listening. The atmosphere inside the hall was no longer academic. It was almost sacred. Where once there had been snickers and smirks, now there was stillness, a quiet curiosity that wrapped the room like a shared breath. Professor Langston cleared his throat. His voice, once bold and unshakable, now held a touch of vulnerability. "Amir," he said slowly, "you've spoken with clarity, but I must ask, how do you explain the violence we often see associated with Islam? The word jihad terrifies many in the West, and the word Sharia, it's practically a warning sign. Is that truly part of a peaceful religion?" A few students braced for discomfort, but Amir simply nodded as though this question too deserved patience, not defense. "Thank you, Professor," he said, "because that question, whispered in private, shouted in fear, is one of the most important to address." He took a step forward, his voice firm yet calm. The word jihad means struggle. Its greatest form is not war, it's the internal struggle. To be better, to control anger, to conquer greed. To rise above ego, he let that settle for a moment before continuing. Yes, Islam allows physical jihad, armed struggle, but only in self-defense. The Quran is clear. No harming civilians, no attacking places of worship, no killing women, children, or even animals. Even trees must not be cut down. War is not the goal. It's the last resort when all peace fails. A history professor in the back raised his eyebrows in quiet surprise. "What about the violence we see today?" a student blurted out from the audience. Amir turned to him steady. "That's not Islam. That's extremism. And extremists don't represent the faith, they betray it, but the media amplifies their voices while ignoring the millions of Muslims who live in peace, raise families, help their neighbors, and serve their communities." He glanced toward Professor Langston. "Terrorism is not Islam. It's a corruption of everything Islam teaches." The professor nodded slowly, visibly processing. "And Sharia?" He asked, "Isn't that dangerous?" Amir shook his head softly. "The word Sharia means a path to water, a way to life. It's not a set of brutal punishments, it's a moral compass. It guides how we pray, how we give charity, how we treat our parents, our spouses, our neighbors, even how we conduct business." Some students looked at each other, visibly moved by the unfamiliar clarity. "It's not about control," Amir said. "It's about character, and Islam teaches us to obey the laws of the lands we live in, so long as they don't force us to violate our core beliefs. The Quran says, there is no compulsion in religion." He paused. "Sharia begins in the heart. It's about justice, mercy, and compassion, far from what the headlines portray." Professor Langston looked down. Slowly, he closed his notebook. All this time, he said softly, "I thought I knew what Islam was." And in that moment, the audience didn't just hear an explanation. They witnessed a man beginning to understand. A hush had settled over the ancient hall. Not the silence of suspense, but the silence of realization. What had started as an intellectual clash had become something far more personal, far more human. Professor Edward Langston stood at the podium, his shoulders slightly hunched, his fingers no longer gripping the edges for control, but for grounding. He looked out at the audience, then back at Amir. His voice, once thundering with certainty, was now quiet, almost frail. "Amir," he began, hesitating for the first time that evening, "I came here today prepared to dismantle what you believe. But something's happened. I don't know how to explain it." Amir didn't answer, he simply listened. "All my life," Langston continued, "I've believed in God, but lately I've felt distant. Like I've been clinging to tradition, doctrine, identity without asking if it still speaks to my heart." His eyes moistened and he blinked slowly, fighting what had been building inside him all night. "Hearing you talk about the oneness of God," about his mercy, his justice, his wisdom. It's like something I buried long ago is waking up. Amir took a step forward, his voice soft, unwavering. Sometimes the heart recognizes the truth before the mind is ready to admit it. That's not weakness, Professor. That's sincerity. Langston's lips trembled. If I were to truly believe that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger, what would that mean for me? I'm a Reverend A professor. I've spoken against Islam publicly. What would people say? Amir looked at him, his expression full of peace. They'll say what they want, but God will know what's in your heart. And on the day when nothing else matters, that's what will count. The audience was still, many holding their breath as if witnessing something sacred unfolding before their eyes. Professor Langston glanced down, then looked back up. His voice broke. Then, guide me. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some students covered their mouths. Others wiped tears they didn't expect. A few simply stood frozen in awe. Amir stepped beside him, hand on his shoulder. Repeat after me. And in a voice choked with emotion, Professor Edward Langston said, I bear witness that there is no God but Allah. And I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Tears streamed freely down his face. The audience, Christian, Muslim, atheist, rose to their feet. Some applauded, some wept. Others bowed their heads in silence. Amir embraced him not as a victor, but as a brother. And in that embrace, the once proud skeptic was no longer a challenger of Islam. He was a believer in the heart of a hall built for intellect. Something eternal had just taken place. Not the defeat of one worldview, but the awakening of a soul. The air in the hall hung thick with emotion, sacred, unspoken, undeniable. Where once there had been laughter and skepticism, now there were tears and awe. The same audience that had come expecting an intellectual spectacle now stood witnessing something far greater, the quiet, powerful transformation of a man who had lived a life in certainty, only to find deeper truth in surrender. Professor Edward Langston, once a firm opponent of Islam, now sat quietly, his glasses resting in his lap, eyes glistening with tears. The weight he once wore as armor had slipped from his shoulders, replaced by something lighter, something real. Amir stood beside him, not triumphant, not proud, but steady, gracious, calm. He had never raised his voice, never boasted. He had only offered sincerity and knowledge, and that more than arguments or force had touched hearts. Across the room, something was stirring. A young woman in the second row clutched her notebook to her chest. A graduate student raised in a secular home whispered, I need to learn more. A Christian student wiped his cheeks and stared at the stage, whispering, This wasn't a debate. In the back corner, a professor of comparative religion whispered to his colleague, We didn't witness a theological exchange. We witnessed an awakening. For the first time, the word jihad no longer echoed with fear. The word Sharia no longer conjured shadows. Islam, once thought of in fragments and headlines, had taken form in the shape of humility, wisdom, and mercy. Amir stepped forward one last time, addressing the room not with superiority, but with a quiet invitation. Truth, he said gently, doesn't always come with thunder. Sometimes it whispers, and all it takes to hear it is a willing heart. He paused, then added, We live in a world filled with noise, with assumptions, with fear. But sometimes we need to listen, not just with our minds, but with our souls, because truth isn't about winning, it's about awakening. The hall fell into deep, reflective stillness. Amir turned to leave the stage. But as he did, the entire room rose to its feet, not for a performer, not for a champion, but for a voice of clarity in a world that too often drowns in confusion. And Professor Langston, he stood too, slower than the rest, still wiping away tears. But in his eyes there was no shame, only peace. He placed a hand over his chest. For the first time in decades, he wasn't defending anything. He was simply believing. And in that moment, inside the grand hall of tradition and reason, something timeless was reborn. Not a religion, but the courage to question, the grace to listen, and the strength to change. The grand lecture hall slowly emptied, but the atmosphere lingered, charged with something unseen, something unshakable. Students moved quietly, some exchanging looks of disbelief, others still wiping away silent tears. Professors once poised for academic combat now walked in humbled silence. At the edge of the stage, Amir sat alone for a moment, his backpack resting at his side. The evening's weight finally beginning to settle on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a gift. He didn't feel victorious. He felt grateful. Behind him, Professor Edward Langston remained seated, gazing into the quiet distance of the now dim room. The Quran that Amir had placed in his hands rested gently in his lap. His fingers traced the edges of its cover, not with fear but with reverence. All these years, he finally whispered, "I thought I had to defend truth, but I was defending pride." Amir turned slightly but didn't interrupt. "I taught students to question, but I never questioned myself, not deeply, not where it hurt." His voice trembled, not out of shame, but awakening. And today, he continued, "A young man with a calm voice and a worn-out backpack showed me that the truth doesn't need to be forced, it only needs to be spoken." Amir smiled gently. "Truth isn't fragile," he said, "but sometimes the heart is. So it knocks softly, not to break, but to open." A moment passed between them, silent but filled with meaning. Across the university, word of the event began to spread, not as a scandal, not as a spectacle, but as a story. A professor's public repentance, a student's quiet strength, a faith misunderstood, finally heard, and for many who heard it, the question wasn't who won, it was what if he's right. That night, dozens of students searched for answers. Some read translations of the Quran for the first time. Others replayed the moment of the Shahada on their phones in stunned reflection. But perhaps the most important lesson wasn't about theology, it was about humility. About listening, truly listening. Not to argue, but to understand. It was about the courage to ask uncomfortable questions and the grace to answer them without fear. It was about a young man who didn't raise his voice once, yet shook the foundations of years of arrogance. And it was about a scholar who, at the height of his prestige, admitted he had been wrong, not defeated but freed, because truth, when spoken with sincerity, doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be heard. And for those who heard it that night, it would never be forgotten. He walked on stage to expose Islam, confident, respected, and ready to dismantle it in front of thousands. His opponent, not a scholar, not a sheikh, just a quiet Muslim girl. Barely 20. Everyone thought she'd be crushed, but then something no one expected happened. Question by question, her calm answers began to shake him. And then right there, the man who came to destroy Islam said the Shahada. The crowd froze. Cameras kept rolling, and the world watched a soul surrender, not to pressure, but to truth. What did she say that broke a scholar's pride in minutes? You're about to find out if your heart is ready. Press 1 to begin. The Grand Hall of King's Cross Auditorium in London pulsed with anticipation. Over 2,000 people had filled every seat, and thousands more watched the live stream titled "Truth Exposed: Christianity versus Islam." The event had been marketed for weeks as the ultimate showdown in interfaith debate, where Christianity's most formidable scholar would dismantle the contradictions of Islam in front of a live audience. Standing backstage, Dr. Edward Langston adjusted his tie with the confidence of a man who had done this 100 times. A respected Christian theologian, he was known for his fierce critiques of Islam, sharp wit, and methodical dismantling of his opponents. To him, this wasn't just a debate, it was a statement. He would prove that Islam was man-made, inconsistent, and flawed. When the moderator introduced the speakers, applause thundered for Dr. Langston. Then came the second name, Aliyah Rahman. The applause stuttered, confused murmurs broke out. A few chuckles, out walked a 20-year-old Muslim woman in a simple navy blue hijab, holding a notepad, her posture calm and eyes steady. Aliyah took her seat across from Dr. Langston without saying a word. The contrast was striking: an old professor with decades of experience, and a young woman most assumed was in over her head. Langston leaned forward, slightly smiling. "Shall we begin?" The moderator nodded. The cameras zoomed in, and just like that, the debate began. But no one, not even Langston, had any idea that the night wouldn't end in mockery. It would end in tears, silence, and the Shahada whispered from the very lips that sought to reject it. Dr. Edward Langston leaned into the microphone, his fingers laced confidently in front of him. "Let's begin," he said with a grin that bordered on theatrical. "Islam claims to be a religion of peace, yet history tells us otherwise. What about the wars, the conquests, the violence in your scripture? Can peace be built on blood?" He looked to the audience as if expecting applause. Some clapped, others nodded. Aliyah Rahman didn't flinch. She took a breath, then raised her eyes to meet his, not with confrontation, but calm. "Thank you, Dr. Langston." She began, her voice gentle but steady. "You mentioned history, so let's go there. When Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, entered Mecca at the head of an army after years of persecution and exile, what did he do to his enemies?" Langston didn't answer. "He forgave them," Aliyah continued. "All of them, no blood, no revenge. And the Quran, it says, if they incline toward peace, then you must incline toward peace as well. War in Islam isn't about domination, it's about defense, protection, justice." The hall grew quiet. A few heads turned toward Langston. His smile faltered slightly. He cleared his throat. "Fine, but what about women in Islam? Hijab, inheritance laws. Isn't that proof your religion devalues women?" Aliyah's expression didn't change. She reached into her folder and held up a page. "This," she said, "is a legal document from 7th century Arabia, dictated by the Prophet himself. It granted a woman named Salama the right to own, inherit, and manage her wealth independently at a time when most societies treated women as property." She looked at the audience now. Islam didn't oppress women, it liberated them long before anyone else even considered them. Equal gasps rippled quietly across the room. One woman in the second row lowered her eyes, suddenly thoughtful. Langston pushed again, his tone sharper. "Then why do apostates get punished in Islam? Why can't people leave your religion freely?" Aliyah responded without hesitation. "Do you know what the Prophet did when people left Islam?" Langston shrugged. He let them go. No harm, no punishment. The rulings that came later were political, linked to treason, rebellion, and warfare. Islam protects conscience. The Quran says, there is no compulsion in religion. Our faith cannot be forced, it must be chosen. The hall was silent again. Not hostile, not cheering, just listening. Langston looked at his notes, then at Aliyah, then back at the crowd. Something in his chest tightened. He had expected an emotional, shaky defense. Instead, this girl, this student, was responding with facts, references, and a calm he couldn't disrupt. He tried again. "If Islam is truth, then why aren't Muslims everywhere prospering? Why are so many of your countries full of corruption, war, and poverty?" Aliyah closed her folder. She didn't need it anymore. "Is a school judged by its books or by how its students use them?" she asked. Langston blinked. "The Quran is perfect," she said. "But Muslims, we are human. We fail. We fall short. But our shortcomings don't define Islam. They remind us to return to it." This time there was no comeback, no laugh, just stillness. Aliyah looked directly at him. "Dr. Langston, you didn't come here to learn about Islam. You came to defeat it. But truth doesn't need defense. It just needs to be heard." A hush spread like fog across the auditorium. Somewhere in the back, a man whispered, "Subhanallah." And for the first time in his long career of debating, Dr. Edward Langston wasn't thinking about how to win. He was wondering why everything he believed suddenly felt so quiet. Dr. Edward Langston sat motionless, staring at the young woman before him, his lips pressed into a thin line, fingers twitching against the edge of the table. For the first time in decades of public debates, he had no immediate counter. Not because he lacked words, but because the words that filled his script no longer felt sufficient. Aliyah sat with quiet composure, no smugness, no victory in her eyes, just patience. "I'll ask you this," Langston said at last, voice more subdued. "If God is truly loving, why would he create hell? If he's all merciful, why is eternal punishment even an option?" Aliyah smiled softly. "Langston," she said, "do you believe a good judge should punish a murderer?" "Of course," he replied without hesitation. "And if that judge let him walk free without justice, Would you still call him good? Langston hesitated, then shook his head slowly. God is merciful, yes, but he is also just. He gives warnings, guidance signs, and still some people knowingly spread corruption, injustice, and arrogance. Hell isn't cruelty. It's justice for those who refuse every chance to change. A few people in the crowd nodded, eyes lowered. Others looked toward the stage with softened faces. Langston leaned back slightly. His carefully rehearsed challenges were evaporating like fog under sunlight. He tried again. If Islam is the truth, why didn't God send another prophet after Muhammad? Why did it all end there? Aliyah didn't miss a beat. Because truth was completed, the final message was given. Just like you don't keep adding chapters to a finished book, there's no need for another prophet. The Quran is complete, and it still speaks unchanged, unedited, memorized by millions. That in itself is a miracle. Langston swallowed. A strange feeling brewed in his chest, something between unease and awe. He had always dismissed Islam as rigid and backward, but what he saw now was different: clarity without arrogance, strength wrapped in gentleness, wisdom spoken without ego. Aliyah shifted slightly forward, her voice lowered. May I ask you something? Dr. Langston nodded slowly. You believe in Jesus, peace be upon him, correct? Of course. Then did he ever say in any gospel, I am God, worship me? Langston opened his mouth, but stopped. Aliyah continued. He spoke of God, he prayed to God, he submitted to God. That is what a Muslim does. The silence in the auditorium was now total. One woman clutched her crucifix. A man in the front row looked down at his phone, then back at Aliyah with a blank stare, as if everything he'd assumed had quietly unraveled. Langston leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes searching. You speak of God with such certainty. How can you at your age be so sure? Aliyah looked at him not as an opponent, but as a fellow seeker. Because I've tasted the peace that comes when your heart no longer wrestles with man-made contradictions. Because the Quran doesn't just speak to scholars, it speaks to the soul. And because when you stop fighting truth, it stops feeling like a threat. That sentence hit him like a wave. Something in him recoiled, but not in anger, in recognition, in mourning for what he had refused to consider for so long. He looked down at his notes again, but this time they looked like scribbles, like noise. Around the hall, people leaned in, no longer watching a debate. They were witnessing a transformation. Langston raised his eyes to meet hers again, and for the first time his voice cracked when he spoke. I don't know what's happening to me, but I can't deny this feels different. Aliyah didn't say a word. She just waited, because she knew his walls were no longer standing. Dr. Edward Langston sat in a silence he hadn't known in years. His hands, once steeled by certainty, now trembled slightly as they rested on the edge of the table. His notes sat untouched, irrelevant now, like weapons left on the battlefield. After the war had already been lost in the heart, Aliyah remained composed, still seated across from him. Her expression was not one of victory, but of compassion, almost as if she were waiting for something greater than applause. Then he spoke. For years, he said slowly, I've led people into debates against Islam. I've studied the Quran, looking for contradictions. I've quoted verses without context, and I've heard Muslims defend their faith with passion. He paused, but not like this. Aliyah said nothing. She knew he wasn't speaking to her. He was speaking to the war within himself. You didn't argue, he said, eyes beginning to glisten. You didn't attack, you just told the truth. The crowd was still. No one dared interrupt. Even the cameras zoomed in, but the crew behind them barely breathed. Langston straightened his back as if clinging to what little control he had left. Then answer me this: if Islam is true, why do I feel so afraid right now? Aliyah finally responded. Her voice was soft yet unwavering, because the heart recognizes truth even when the mind resists it. Fear comes when we sense that everything we built might have been built on sand. A tear slipped down his cheek. The audience didn't gasp. They mourned with him, quietly, reverently. Langston looked around the room. So many familiar faces, friends, followers, students all watching. What would they think if he broke now? What would happen to his reputation, his books, his decades of work? But another thought pushed through. What would happen to my soul if I ignored this moment? Aliyah leaned forward slightly. Dr. Langston. Truth doesn't humiliate us, it humbles us. That's the difference. That broke something deep. He stood up slowly. The crowd murmured. "I need a moment," he said, stepping away from the table and walking toward the edge of the stage. His steps were heavy as though everyone required surrender. The moderator looked unsure. The audience was on edge. Then Langston turned to them, voice shaking. "My whole life I've searched for God through theology, debate, and tradition. I thought I had him figured out. But tonight I didn't just hear about God, I met the truth." He looked at Aaliyah, eyes brimming with tears, and it came from someone I never expected. A young woman who reminded me what humility sounds like. Gasps swept through the hall. Some stood in disbelief, others sat frozen. The moment was no longer academic, it was sacred. Langston stepped back to the microphone. "I never thought these words would leave my mouth," he said, struggling to steady his breath. "But I bear witness that there is no God but Allah." A sound caught in his throat as emotion overtook him. "And I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah." The hall exploded not with applause but with takbir. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. People wept, some fell to their knees. Even the moderator had tears in his eyes. Aliyah lowered her gaze, her lips moving in silent praise to Allah. She hadn't debated to win, she had spoken to awaken, and now before thousands, a man who came to destroy Islam had been reborn by it. The sound of Allahu Akbar still echoed faintly in the vast hall, like the final note of a symphony that had left everyone breathless. Some in the audience clutched their chests, others sat with trembling hands as if witnessing something their hearts understood before their minds could catch up. Dr. Edward Langston now. Simply Edward stood still. His face was damp with tears, not of shame, but of release. The burden of decades, ego pride, certainty had fallen in a single confession. A confession not of defeat, but of surrender to truth. Behind the cameras, the production crew sat stunned. A technician who had once rolled his eyes at the event wiped away a single tear. One of the Christian organizers stepped back slowly from the aisle, pale, speechless. It was no longer a debate, it had become something holy. Edward looked down at his trembling hands. "I feel," he said softly, "like I've been fighting against something that only ever wanted to give me peace." Aliyah remained seated, her hands folded, gaze lowered. She offered no self-congratulation, no smug glance. Just a warm, sincere smile that radiated quiet gratitude. She had not come for applause. She had come for the truth to be heard. A woman from the crowd stood up, mid-30s, Christian red scarf over her shoulder. Her voice cracked as she spoke. Why were we never told any of this? Why were we taught to fear Islam instead of understand it? Her question wasn't rhetorical. It was raw, vulnerable. Aliyah looked up gently, because fear blinds the heart, but truth doesn't knock down doors. It waits until you're ready to open them. The woman covered her mouth, sat down slowly, tears brimming in her eyes. The moderator stepped forward, unsure of what to say. This wasn't the event he expected to close. He cleared his throat and turned to Edward. "Dr. Langston." "I mean, Brother Edward." "What now?" Edward exhaled, still shaken but resolute. "I don't know," he replied, "but I want to learn. I want to unlearn. I want to meet the God I thought I already knew." With new eyes, a round of subdued murmurs followed, agreeing. Reflecting, several audience members nodded, visibly moved. A man from the Christian delegation stood and walked out briskly. He couldn't take it, but he was only one. Dozens stayed, dozens lingered, and dozens more stood, shoulders softened, hearts open. Then something unexpected happened. A young man in the third row raised his hand. "I came here with anger in my heart," he confessed, voice trembling. "I wanted to see Islam lose, but now I feel like something inside me is waking up." He walked slowly to the front, faced the microphone, and said with a cracking voice, "I'm not ready yet, but I want to know more. I want to know what he just found." The crowd was still. Again, Aliyah smiled, eyes glassy. The moderator, now visibly moved, whispered into his mic, "We may need to extend this session." Laughter bubbled softly, not mockery, but relief. The tension had broken. Something new had begun. Outside, the night sky over London was unusually clear. Stars shimmered above the old city, indifferent to debates, but bearing witness to every heart that turned toward the truth. Inside, Edward sat down again, this time beside Aliyah. "Thank you," he whispered. She looked at him gently. "Don't thank me," she replied. "Thank the one who softened your heart." He nodded slowly, and in that sacred pause, with nothing left to argue and everything left to discover, the real journey began. News of the unexpected Shahada spread like wildfire. By morning, clips of Edward Langston's testimony had gone viral. The once confident Christian theologian reciting the Shahada beside a Muslim student shocked millions. Headlines raced across platforms, Christian scholar converts in live debate. From opposition to Islam, Langston's turning point. Truth on stage. A debate that became dawah. But beyond the media frenzy, something deeper was unfolding. At a small cafe near the university campus, Aliyah sat alone by a window. Her tea had long gone cold untouched. She wasn't scrolling through the news. She wasn't basking in attention. She was reflecting on how Allah, in His infinite wisdom, had used her not with grandeur, but through simplicity to guide a heart. Her phone buzzed. Dozens of messages from strangers poured in. "I watched the debate and cried, I had doubts about Islam. But now I want to learn. I'm not Muslim, but I've never seen someone speak about faith with such clarity. Can I ask you questions about Islam?" She read each one with humility. A reminder that dawah isn't just what you say, it's how you carry truth without ego. Just as the Prophet taught with wisdom, gentleness, and patience. Across the city, Edward sat in his study. The walls around him still held relics of his past life. Christian texts, theology, awards, debate trophies. But today they felt like souvenirs from another lifetime. He didn't know where to start, but he knew he had to start. He opened a fresh notebook and wrote just one line at the top. "The God I thought I knew and the one who showed me mercy." A knock came at the door. His daughter stood there teary-eyed. "Dad," she said softly, "I watched the debate." He tensed. Was she angry? Ashamed? But she stepped in, knelt beside him and whispered, "I want to know what you found." His heart swelled, not with pride, but with hope. Truth was not just changing him, it was reaching those around him, echoing outward. Meanwhile, at a local masjid, the imam played the clip during a youth circle. Dozens of Muslim teens sat transfixed, watching Aliyah's calm responses, her quiet strength. "See," the imam said, "you don't have to be a scholar to speak the truth. You just have to know it and live it." One boy in the back raised his hand. "Can we have a girls' session too? I want my sister to hear this." Even those outside the faith felt the impact. A Christian professor who had mentored Edward for years wrote a blog titled, "When Truth is Stronger Than Loyalty." He didn't convert, but he admitted, "For the first time I truly listened, and it shook me." What began as a staged intellectual ambush had bloomed into something far more profound, a movement of hearts. Not because someone was defeated, but because someone dared to listen, because someone dared to speak gently when others expected her to crumble. Because sincerity, when rooted in truth, leaves ripples that stretch far beyond the walls they began in. And Aliyah. She returned to her classes the next day with the same white hijab, the same quiet walk, the same unread tea beside her. She hadn't changed, but everything around her had. She was no longer just a student. She was a reminder that one voice, one moment, one sincere soul can awaken a world asleep. It was Friday. The sun hung gently above London's skyline as Aliyah entered the masjid just minutes before Jumu'ah. She slipped off her shoes, greeted a few familiar faces, and took a seat near the back of the sisters section. No cameras, no lights, no attention, just her in the stillness of worship. The world outside buzzed with her name, news headlines, blogs, interview requests. But inside this house of Allah, she was just another servant, bowing before the one who sees hearts. As the imam delivered the khutbah, her eyes welled up, not from exhaustion, but gratitude. Gratitude for being used as a means. Gratitude for witnessing what sincere speech untainted by ego could do. Gratitude for seeing someone find peace in the same light she held on to. Meanwhile, in a small room across town, Edward Langston sat cross-legged with a Quran open before him. A local convert mentor was teaching him how to pronounce the Arabic. He stumbled over letters, laughed at himself, apologized repeatedly, but there was a sparkle in his eyes that hadn't been there for years. "Take your time," the brother said warmly. "The Quran doesn't rush anyone. It meets you where your heart is." Edward smiled, running his fingers along the verses. "For years I thought I was teaching people about God," he said, "but I had never actually met him until now." Across social media, the viral video continued to inspire a quiet revolution. Messages poured in from South Africa, Malaysia, Canada, and Brazil. "I used to hate Islam. Now I cry watching this. My mother embraced Islam after seeing the debate. This girl showed me Islam isn't what I thought it was, but Aliyah refused all interviews. No podcast appearances, no profile pieces. Her message was clear. It wasn't about me, it was about the message." That Friday evening, she walked alone along the River Thames, the water sparkling beneath the amber sky. Her reflection danced across the surface as gentle wind tugged at her hijab. She paused on a quiet bridge and watched the city move around her, so unaware of how close it had come to something sacred just days before. Behind her, footsteps approached. She turned to see Edward dressed modestly now, his expression one of peace. He had come at her request, not for fame but for prayer. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "You already did," she replied, smiling. "By changing," he nodded. "It's strange," he said. "All my life I stood in front of people to speak, but when the truth finally reached me, I had nothing to say, only tears." She looked toward the river. "Sometimes tears are the first words of the soul," she said softly. The two stood in silence, not awkward, not heavy, just still. Then Edward looked up. "What should I do next?" Aliyah didn't answer immediately. She let the question breathe. "Learn," she finally said. "Pray and serve. But most of all, stay sincere." He closed his eyes for a moment and nodded, "I will." They parted with salams, and as Aliyah walked into the softening dusk, her steps were light, not because of what she had done, but because she knew who had done it through her. Somewhere in a distant part of the world, another person clicked the video. Another heart stirred, another mind opened. And just like that, the flame spread again. Not with noise, but with light. Because truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be spoken with sincerity. This story reminds us that truth doesn't need power, fame, or a crowd to defend it. It only needs sincerity. Aliyah didn't win the debate through cleverness or aggression. She won hearts through humility, clarity, and unshakable faith. Her calm responses and refusal to boast show that real strength lies not in volume, but in conviction. Dr. Langston's transformation teaches us that even the most prideful heart can be softened when it is met not with hostility, but with compassion and truth. In life, we often cling to ideas out of fear, fear of change, fear of being wrong, fear of losing control. But this story shows that when we let go of ego and listen, sincerely, truth has the power to heal, to guide, and to transform. Whether we are the one speaking or the one listening, our duty is the same approach every moment, with honesty, patience, and a heart open to learning. Because sometimes one sincere conversation, spoken not to win, but to awaken, can change not. What happens when a quiet Muslim student is mocked, challenged, and pushed to her limit right in front of her entire class? In a packed university lecture hall, a philosophy professor launches a public attack on Islam, expecting silence, fear, or defeat. But what he didn't expect was Sophia, dressed modestly, heart steady and mind sharp. She rises not with anger, but with calm truth that leaves an entire classroom speechless, and her professor in tears. What began as ridicule turns into revelation. What started as a debate becomes a transformation. This isn't just a story, it's a reminder of the power of faith, patience, and sincerity in the face of ignorance. Stay with us until the end. You won't believe what the professor does next. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful real-life stories that touch hearts and open minds. Sophia walked into her philosophy class just like she did every Monday morning. Her shoulders were straight, her chin held high, and her hijab neatly wrapped and elegant, was a statement of dignity, not defiance, but she could feel the eyes on her, the same eyes that Judge whispered and sometimes chuckled as she passed. To most of her classmates, Sophia was that girl, the one who didn't blend in, the one who still believed in religion, especially one as misunderstood as Islam. While others wore t-shirts and jeans, Sophia wore modest clothes that covered her arms and legs. Her faith wasn't just private, it was visible, and in a secular classroom, that visibility made her a target. She wasn't new to the snide remarks. "Doesn't your scarf get hot?" one had joked last week. Another had whispered behind her back. "There's the fanatic again." Some looked at her like she was from another century, but what they didn't see was the strength behind her silence. The countless nights she cried in private, the mornings she whispered prayers for patience, the quiet resolve she carried like armor. She never lashed out. She never let it break her. Sophia knew that her faith wasn't something to hide. It was her anchor. Today, as she walked into class, she had no idea that the professor himself, Dr. Anderson, would take the lead in mocking her religion. She had no idea that this day would challenge everything she believed and reveal a strength she didn't know the world needed to see. And so while the class prepared for another lecture, Sophia prepared for something greater, not just to listen, but perhaps to be heard. The classroom quieted as Dr. Anderson walked in, briefcase in hand, suit pressed and posture commanding. He was well respected in the academic world, a seasoned professor known for his sharp tongue, unapologetic skepticism, and harsh critiques of organized religion. But if there was one faith he particularly singled out, it was Islam. He stood at the front of the room, hands clasped behind his back, scanning the faces of his students. "Good morning," he said. "Today we're going to explore why people still cling to ancient beliefs in an age of science, logic, and progress. And more specifically, why some still follow Islam." His voice was calm, but his words carried a distinct bite. Muffled laughter rose from the back row. Sophia didn't look back. She stared at her notebook, heart pounding. She knew where this was going. Dr. Anderson continued, "Fasting, pilgrimage, bowing in prayer. What value do these rituals really hold in the modern world? Isn't circling a black stone in the desert just symbolic superstition? Why do some believe in a book filled with contradictions written by an illiterate man in the 7th century?" This time the laughter wasn't muffled, it was clear. A few students turned to glance at Sophia, as if expecting her to recoil, to wither under the weight of the words, but she didn't. Her hands remained steady on the desk. She blinked slowly, breathing in. Every sentence was like a jab, but not one she hadn't felt before. Dr. Anderson paced the room, now growing bolder. "Religions, especially Islam, demand blind obedience. They ask followers to silence reason in favor of outdated doctrine. Tell me, how can we trust a system that punishes questions?" That was the final nudge. Sophia looked up, not in anger, but with something deeper. A steady calm. She raised her hand. The room fell still. Dr. Anderson stopped mid-step, his brow arched in surprise. He gestured toward her. "Yes, Miss Sophia," she replied, her voice even, and with respect. "Professor, I'd like to respond." A wave of tension moved through the room. Some leaned forward. Others braced for what they assumed would be emotional defensive words. But Sophia didn't offer either. She straightened in her seat, glanced around the room, then looked her professor in the eye. "Islam doesn't ask us to ignore reason. It calls us to seek it. The Quran tells us to reflect, to question, to understand. If we mock faith without ever studying it, are we not the ones silencing reason?" Dr. Anderson paused. The students watched, stunned, as the dynamic shifted. The girl they used to whisper about was now commanding the room with calm clarity. Sophia wasn't here to debate for victory. She was here for something more: truth. And as the professor prepared to respond, he didn't realize the real lecture was just beginning. A beat of silence hung in the air. One of those rare moments when time feels suspended. Dr. Anderson, caught off guard by Sophia's composure, took a small step back. The class, expecting hesitation or fumbling, was stunned to see none. Sophia stood up slowly, her notebook still in hand. Her voice, though soft, carried unmistakable conviction. "You mentioned fasting, Professor," she began, "and questioned its relevance. But did you know that leading medical journals in the US have now published studies linking intermittent fasting to better brain function, lower inflammation, and even longer lifespan? A few students blinked. Someone in the second row nodded slightly. Sophia continued, Muslims have fasted for over 400 years, not out of superstition, but as a form of discipline. It teaches patience, empathy, and gratitude. During Ramadan, we not only refrain from food, but from anger, gossip, and selfishness. It's not punishment, it's purification. She paused, then turned toward Dr. Anderson again. And as for the pilgrimage to Mecca, yes, Muslims walk around the Kaaba. But let me ask, is it any less meaningful than millions of Americans gathering every year for the Super Bowl, wearing the same colors, singing the same songs, cheering as one voice? A soft laugh escaped one student, but not mockingly, more like a sudden realization. We find purpose in unity. She said Hajj is the largest peaceful gathering in the world. No VIP seats, no status. Everyone wears the same white garment, rich, poor, black, white, standing equal before God. Doctor, Anderson folded his arms, clearly unsettled. And about the Quran, Sophia added, holding up her own copy. It doesn't demand blind obedience. In fact, it says, do they not reflect upon the Quran, or are there locks upon their hearts? Quran 47:24. She scanned the room, then spoke slowly, purposefully. The Quran invites reason. It challenges readers to question, to reflect. It talks about the formation of the embryo in the womb in exact stages, information confirmed by science only in the last century. It describes the barrier between salt water and fresh water. It even hints at the expansion of the universe. All this from a man who couldn't read or write. The classroom was no longer dismissive, it was thoughtful, even reverent. Dr. Anderson opened his mouth, perhaps to reclaim his authority, but Sophia wasn't finished. I'm not asking you to believe, Professor. I'm asking you to reconsider what you think you already know. You say Islam is about submission without thought, but I say it's about surrendering after deep thought to a creator who asks us to think, to question, and to rise above ego. She sat back down slowly. Her words, though calm, echoed in the room like ripples across still water. No one laughed, no one smirked, and for the first time in that class, people truly listened. The silence that followed Sophia's words was not just from surprise, it was from something deeper. It was the silence of reflection, the kind that creeps in when truth stirs the heart and challenges long-held assumptions. Dr. Anderson cleared his throat, visibly unsettled but unwilling to lose control of the discussion. He took a breath, trying to reassert his authority. All right, Sophia, he said, you speak of purpose, logic, and peace. But if Islam is so merciful, how do you explain hell, eternal punishment? Doesn't that contradict the idea of a loving God? A few students leaned forward. The question hit home for many, not just as an argument against Islam, but as a challenge to belief in God altogether. Sophia nodded gently, as if she had expected the question. Professor, she said calmly, do you believe a good society needs a justice system? He hesitated, then replied, of course. And would you agree, she continued, that a judge must hold people accountable for their actions, for the sake of victims, and for the sake of fairness? Yes, he admitted. Sophia leaned slightly forward. Then why should God be any different? A murmur rippled through the room. Hell, she explained, is not a contradiction to God's mercy. It's a reflection of his justice. In this life, people can lie, steal, murder, and never face consequences. But Islam teaches that every soul will be held accountable not by public opinion, but by the one who knows all intentions. Dr. Anderson's expression softened, not in agreement, but in recognition. And just like any good judge, Sophia continued, God doesn't rush to punish. He gives warnings, guidance, a lifetime of second chances. In fact, one of his names in Islam is Al-Ghaffar, the constant forgiver. She paused, letting her words settle. In the Quran, she added, God says, do not despair of the mercy of Allah. Indeed, he forgives all sins. Surah Az-Zumar 39:53. A few students exchanged glances, some surprised, others visibly moved. Hell exists, Sophia said, because justice demands consequences. But even then, Islam teaches that many will be forgiven, that even one sincere tear of repentance can wipe away years of sin. It's not about cruelty, it's about accountability. Dr. Anderson stared at her, his usual sharp rebuttal noticeably absent. Sophia then looked around the classroom. Imagine if there were no consequences in this world. What would stop people from harming others without guilt? Would that be compassion or chaos? The room was still. The question needed no answer. And yet she added softly, God's mercy is always greater than his wrath. The door to repentance stays open until our last breath. That's not something to fear. It's something to be grateful for. A hush fell over the room. This wasn't the voice of someone trying to win an argument. It was the voice of someone who understood what it meant to believe with both the heart and the mind. And for the first time, Dr. Anderson didn't speak. He just listened. The room remained still more silent now than it had been all semester. Even the students who normally scrolled through their phones or whispered during lectures were fully tuned in. Dr. Anderson's usual confidence had been replaced by quiet contemplation, but he wasn't done. Leaning forward slightly, his voice lower than before, he asked, If your religion values compassion and justice, Sophia, why does it place restrictions on women? Why do they have to cover themselves? Why don't they inherit equally? Isn't that inequality oppression? It was a question loaded with assumptions. Some students nodded, subtly expecting Sophia to fumble. But she didn't. Sophia took a breath, then spoke with gentle conviction. Professor, do you believe a woman has the right to dress how she chooses? She asked. Dr. Anderson nodded cautiously. Yes, as long as it's her choice. Sophia gave a small appreciative smile. Then if a woman chooses to dress modestly because it reflects her values, protects her dignity, and gives her peace, shouldn't that choice be respected too? A few students in the room shifted uncomfortably, as if they had never thought of it that way before. The hijab, she continued, is not about hiding or submission. It's about self-respect. It reminds us in the world that our worth isn't based on appearance. It's about intention and identity. She paused, then gently turned to the topic of inheritance. As for inheritance, yes, sometimes men receive more. But what's rarely explained is that men in Islam are obligated to financially support their entire family. Women are not. Whatever a woman inherits is hers alone. She's not required to spend it, not on her husband, her children, or anyone else. Several students now leaned forward, intrigued rather than skeptical. Sophia went on, her voice steady, her eyes calm. In Islam's early days, women were given rights when most of the world denied them any rights to own property, to vote in communal decisions, to initiate divorce, and to be educated. The first university in the world was founded by a Muslim woman in Morocco. Our history isn't one of oppression, it's one of dignity. Dr. Anderson blinked. For once, he had no quick response. And the Prophet Muhammad, Sophia added, stood and welcomed his daughter Fatima every time she entered the room. He said, The best among you are those who are best to their wives. That's the man our faith calls us to follow. From the back of the room, a female student raised her hand slowly. Her voice was quiet but sincere. I used to think Islam made women weak, she said. But now I'm realizing maybe I just never really understood it. Sophia offered a humble nod. This isn't about proving someone wrong, she said softly. It's about inviting people to see the full picture. And in that moment, the image of a silenced Muslim woman began to unravel, replaced by one of strength, clarity, and undeniable grace. The room felt different now. Something invisible had shifted, like a veil had been lifted, revealing a world that most had never paused long enough to truly see. Even Dr. Anderson, who had once held the floor with unshakable certainty, now stood quieter, his posture softening. He cleared his throat. You speak with conviction, Sophia, but belief in a divine book, that's a high claim. What makes you so sure the Quran isn't just another text written by a man who wanted influence or control? The question lingered in the air, respectful but challenging. Sophia didn't flinch. She gently held up the small copy of the Quran she always kept in her bag. The gold lettering on the dark cover caught the light. I understand the skepticism, Professor. Truly, she began. But let me ask you and everyone here a simple question. She paused, allowing the room to lean in. Do you know of any other book over 1 hour 400 years old that speaks in detail about things science only confirmed in the last century? A book that hasn't changed by even a single letter since it was revealed. No one answered. Sophia continued flipping open the book in her hands. In Surah Al-Anbiya, verse 30, it says, "Do not the disbelievers see that the heavens and the earth were joined together? Then we split them apart." That's the Big Bang spoken about 14 centuries ago. A few students sat up straighter. One glanced down at his tablet to look it up. In another verse, she added, the Quran says, "And we made every living thing from water." That's cell biology. Every organism, plant, animal, human, is mostly water. Dr. Anderson remained silent, his eyebrows furrowed, not in disbelief but in thought. Sophia gently turned the pages again. The Quran even describes embryology from a drop of fluid to a clinging clot to a lump, and then bones clothed with flesh. That was only understood after microscopes and modern imaging. How could an illiterate man in the desert describe what doctors only confirmed recently? The class was no longer listening, they were absorbing. Some even looked awestruck, and linguistically, Sophia added, Arabic scholars, Muslim and non-Muslim, agree. The Quran is unmatched. Its rhythm, its structure, its poetic depth. No one has been able to replicate it. The Quran itself issues a challenge. If you are in doubt about what we have sent down, produce one chapter like it. Surah Al-Baqarah 223. And for 400 years, no one has. Dr. Anderson opened his mouth slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. Sophia looked at him kindly. Professor, this isn't about winning an argument, it's about truth. A man who couldn't read or write brought forth a message that still guides over 1 billion people and aligns with knowledge that didn't exist at the time. The classroom was silent, not from discomfort, but from the realization that maybe, just maybe, they had underestimated something profound. And deep inside, even Dr. Anderson knew these were not the words of a fanatic. They were the echoes of something far greater. The silence in the classroom stretched not awkward, but sacred. A reverent stillness had taken hold, as if even the walls were listening. Dr. Anderson, the man once so proud of his intellect and dismissive of all faith, stood frozen in place. His fingers gripped the edge of the desk, white-knuckled. His breathing had slowed and his gaze dropped to the floor, where his polished shoes now seemed unsteady beneath him. No one moved. Not a pen scratched. Not a cough broke the air. Sophia remained seated, her Quran closed on the desk before her hands folded quietly on top. She didn't look triumphant. She looked gentle, respectful, as if she knew something sacred was unfolding. Not a victory, but a turning. Dr. Anderson finally looked up, his eyes glossy with something no one had seen in him before: vulnerability. "I've debated religion for over 20 years, he said slowly, almost to himself. Mocked it. Ridiculed those who believed I thought I understood. I thought faith was weakness, a crutch for the irrational." He paused, swallowing hard. "But today," he continued, his voice cracking, "something shifted. I didn't expect answers. I expected excuses. I expected you to retreat. But you didn't." His voice fell to a whisper. "You stood there with nothing but truth. And I couldn't move it." A single tear slipped down his cheek. He wiped it quickly as if ashamed, then placed both hands on the podium, steadying himself. "I don't know what's happening to me," he admitted now, looking directly at Sophia. "But I feel like something deep inside me is breaking open." Sophia didn't speak. She just met his eyes with a look that carried no judgment, only compassion. Dr. Anderson's shoulders sank, not in defeat, but in surrender. The kind of surrender that comes not from losing a battle, but from laying down pride. For the first time in a very long time, he said, voice barely audible, "I'm not sure I have all the answers, and I think I need to learn not to argue, just to understand." A hush settled again, heavier now, because this moment wasn't just about him. It was about all the students who had watched him dominate debates and mock believers. Now they watched him tremble under the weight of sincerity. Sophia spoke softly. "That's all any of us can ask for, Professor. A heart open enough to ask and humble enough to listen." He nodded slowly, as if her words had touched a bruise he'd been hiding for years. "I never thought," he said, then stopped, unable to finish. And in that unfinished sentence, the entire classroom heard the unspoken truth that sometimes the strongest moments in a man's life are when he dares to admit he may have been wrong. The classroom felt like it had paused in time. Dr. Anderson remained standing still, the tallest figure in the room, but now looking smaller, somehow more human. His face, once composed and defiant, now reflected a man confronting something far greater than philosophy or intellectual pride. Sophia watched quietly. Her hands rested on her desk. Her Quran untouched, her gaze steady but kind. "I don't know how to explain this," Dr. Anderson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But everything you've said, everything I thought I would tear apart, it's not just logical, it feels right." A few students glanced at one another, stunned. The man who had built a career, mocking faith, was now speaking like a man rediscovering his soul. He turned to the class slowly, his hands trembling. "I've taught many of you to question everything, to reject anything that can't be seen or proven. But I never told you what to do when truth doesn't shout. It whispers. And today something whispered to me, and I couldn't ignore it." The room was completely still. Dr. Anderson turned back to Sophia. "You mentioned something earlier, the Shahada, the declaration of faith. If someone truly believes, they say it." "Right." Sophia nodded slowly, her heart pounding. He took a deep breath, wiped his eyes, and whispered, "Can I say it now?" Gasps rippled through the classroom. A few students covered their mouths, others blinked in disbelief. Sophia stood, moved gently toward him, and said, "Yes, Professor. If you believe in your heart that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger, then you are ready." The professor nodded, and with a shaky voice, hands still trembling, he recited slowly after her, "I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah." The words hung in the air like sunlight after a storm. Tears rolled down his cheeks freely now. Some students wept quietly, others simply sat in awe, stunned by the beauty of what they had witnessed. Sophia smiled, not with pride but with peace. It wasn't about being proven right. It was about someone finding the truth they had once mocked and embracing it with humility. A student in the front row whispered, "I never thought I'd see this happen." Another, once vocal in his criticism of Sophia, now raised his hand slowly and said, "Sophia, would you help me learn more too?" And just like that, the transformation wasn't limited to one man. It had begun to ripple across a classroom that once laughed, judged, and rejected, now awakened, reflective, and ready to learn. Sophia stood beside the man who had once challenged her existence in that space. Now he stood beside her in faith as Dr. Anderson stood beside Sophia, no longer as her skeptic, but now as her fellow believer. The classroom sat in reverent silence. What had begun as another ordinary day in philosophy 201 had become something unforgettable. The professor, who once prided himself on logic and deconstruction, had bowed his heart before a truth he could no longer deny. But even more stunning than his declaration was what happened next. A student in the back, a tall young man who had once chuckled every time Sophia entered the room, raised his hand slowly. I mocked you," he said, voice cracking. "I didn't understand you. I never even tried. But what I just witnessed, it changed something in me." He paused, then added, "Can I talk to you after class? I want to know more." Sophia looked at him and smiled gently. "Of course." Another girl near the windows wiped her eyes and whispered to her friend, "I never thought I'd see him cry." And over something like this, her friend didn't respond, only nodded, her gaze still locked on the front of the room where Sophia and Dr. Anderson stood. The atmosphere had changed completely. The judgment that once clung to Sophia like a shadow had lifted. In its place, curiosity bloomed. Humility stirred. Hearts that once rolled their eyes were now open, vulnerable, and full of questions. Even students who hadn't believed in anything now began to wonder. What was it about her words, about her faith? Sophia didn't bask in the attention. She simply walked back to her seat and sat quietly, hands folded over her notebook. For her, this wasn't a moment of glory. It was a reminder that truth, when delivered with sincerity and patience, can move mountains far greater than intellect alone. Dr. Anderson turned to the class one last time. "Everything I thought I knew about Islam," he said quietly, "was filtered through media prejudice and pride. But today I saw something real, not just in the words, but in Sophia's calm, her character, her clarity." He placed a hand on his heart. "This is what changed me." Students didn't clap. They didn't cheer. Instead, one by one, they began to approach Sophia after class, asking softly if they could speak with her, ask her questions, or simply thank her for her courage. The young woman who had always sat alone at the edge of the room, ignored, underestimated, and often ridiculed, was now surrounded not by applause or praise, but by hearts that were finally listening. And Sophia, still wrapped in her modest scarf and quiet strength, understood something profound. Her faith had not only changed her life, it had started to change others too. Not through arguments, but through grace. That evening, long after the classroom had emptied, Sophia sat alone on a bench outside the university library. The cool breeze tugged gently at her scarf as the sun dipped behind the campus clock tower. She looked up at the sky, her eyes soft, her heart full. What had unfolded that day wasn't something she had planned. She hadn't come to class expecting a debate or a transformation. All she had ever done was remain true to what she believed, answering, not with anger or pride, but with sincerity and quiet strength. And somehow, that had been enough. It wasn't her eloquence that changed hearts or her ability to quote verses. It was the way she carried herself, the way she stood tall, in the face of mockery, spoke gently, when challenged, and chose compassion over combat. Dr. Anderson's words still echoed in her heart. "You didn't try to win, you tried to help me understand." That Sophia knew was the key. Real change doesn't come from overpowering someone in debate. It comes from awakening something within them, something they forgot. They had a heart willing to listen and a soul searching for meaning. And today, through nothing more than patience, humility, and truth, she had helped open that door. As the stars appeared in the twilight sky, Sophia whispered a quiet prayer, not for recognition or reward, but for guidance, that she might continue to be a voice of kindness in a world so often loud with judgment. Because sometimes one quiet voice is all it takes to spark 1,000 awakenings. One of the most profound lessons from Sophia's story is the transformative power of sincerity, patience, and unwavering faith. In a world that often rewards volume over virtue, Sophia shows that truth does not need to shout. It only needs to be spoken with clarity, compassion, and conviction. Her strength wasn't in argument, but in restraint. Her influence didn't come from proving others wrong, but from showing what it means to live with integrity. This teaches us that real change begins not in grand gestures, but in quiet courage, in choosing to be kind when mocked, to stand firm when pressured, and to speak truthfully when it would be easier to stay silent. In my own life, I see the value in responding to hostility, not with defensiveness, but with dignity. Whether in conversations, disagreements, or moments of misunderstanding, the greatest impact often comes when I choose humility over ego and empathy over judgment. Sophia's journey reminds me that I don't have to be loud to be heard. I just have to be real, rooted, and ready to represent what I believe with grace. Because it's not about changing minds instantly, but about planting seeds that may grow in time.